Bien. Bueno, ahora sí, bienvenidos formalmente a todos a la charla. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos otra vez. Tenemos hoy al doctor Fraser Brown, así que lo voy a presentar. La charla, por supuesto, va a ser en inglés. Una vez terminada la presentación del doctor Brown, pueden hacer sus preguntas. Si quieren hacerlas en castellano, no hay ningún problema, nosotros las traduciremos. Y si en algún momento hay algún problema con la interpretación del inglés, por favor avísenos y haremos lo posible por ir traduciendo también. El Dr. Brown se unió en 1962 a los 16 años al Regimiento de Infantería de Black Watch, sirviendo por 7 años en Alemania, Chipre, Libia, Medio Oriente, Canadá y Europa. Así que este es el autor de este libro, de Black Watch, que por supuesto refleja parte de esta historia también. Graduado de la Universidad de Stirling, fue docente y oficial administrativo superior en el distrito de Stirling en escuelas secundarias y de educación especial. También capacitó jóvenes docentes en Escocia, Rumania postcomunista y Pakistán en técnicas de administración de comportamientos. Una vez retirado, completó sus estudios de maestría y doctorado mientras visitaba escuelas locales para el Black Watch Museum. Ha publicado diversos artículos y capítulos de libros en publicaciones sobre la Gran Guerra y es, como decía recién, el coeditor del libro The Black Watch in the Great War, Rediscovered Histories from the Regimental Family. Así que bueno, le agradecemos mucho que nos acompañe hoy y Fraser, all yours.
Okay. Now, if I can have the book, whoops, that's great. Can I have?
Sí, ahora te... Exactamente.
Thank you. For the end of the fighting in 1918, the Argentine contingent of the British Volunteers of Latin America was recognized as a somewhat unusual group of British servicemen. That impression both reflected their situation on the outbreak of war, as well as their service during the conflict. Some of these men held Argentine nationality, and a number had even been Argentine conscripts. A few were born in the countries of the Empire, but most were British born and from every part of the British Isles. Almost all had given up well-paid, secure positions to respond to the call to arms, and unlike the German, French, or Italian returning reservists, they were volunteers. They're not conscripts. After the first wave of volunteers had left, the process of their enlistment also took an unusual form, for Sir Reginald Power, acting through the British Embassy in Buenos Aires, oversaw a discreet but highly effective system of channeling men home to fight. Of course, when citizens of a combatant country living in a neutral country returned home to fight, that brought a number of diplomatic and political risks. In Argentina, a major consideration for the British was that their war aims prioritized the need to secure Argentine war supplies for the Allies, while denying them to Germany. Argentine neutrality, determinedly maintained by both the wartime government of De La Playa, then after 1916 by the successor administration of Irigoyen, had to be respected, which perhaps explains the British avoidance of any military insult, such as the formation of an Anglo-Argentine regiment of volunteers. However, without a formed Argentine unit to act as a focus for recruitment and for study 100 years later, by people like me, that meant the volunteers enlisted as soldiers of the king in different units, so the Argentine contingent was essentially a cross-section of the British Armed Forces. Because of that, it could be argued that the volunteers were no more than a group of individual English-speaking reinforcements from Latin America. This lecture rejects that idea completely and takes the view that the Argentine volunteers were much, much more than that. First of all, the British community in Argentina saw them as more than that. At the Allied peace celebration at La Real in 1919, they marched as a body. Now, in British military custom, if a group marched as a body. It means they are formally recognized as such. They were presented with a medal commemorating their service in the volunteers, and every survivor was given a dedicated copy of Holder's publication activities of the British community in Argentina.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bueno. Holder and others described how welfare arrangements were made for these volunteers and were specifically named as for the Argentine volunteers. In Britain, members on furlough inhabited the Anglo-South American depot and club in London, and they kept in touch with each other through mess book signings, and in the trenches they made very good use of the Buenos Aires Herald supplies of free mate. Next, it had a formal recognition, first on the 5th of July 1915, through an acknowledgement of British community support for the Derby Register, Argentina, and again in a communication from the Army Council to the River Plate Committee in September 1916, expressing their appreciation for the patriotic assistance they'd been given and in sending such a large contingent of men unique in their fighting qualities. However, the most important recognition came in the form of Army Order 1067 on the 24th of September 1918, authorizing the issue of a discreet blue diamond shaped patch with the letters BVLA outlined in gold to be worn on the right breast pocket of the service dress. Although the patch was intended for all Latin American volunteers, the lobbying effort that resulted in Army Order 1067 was largely Argentine. The ultimate form of British military recognition of the BVLA and their service came when those volunteers still in uniform and still in Britain marched as a foreign body. And they are there. But also, not only that, they marched under their own standard. And that is a very, very high level of military recognition. So what did the Argentine contingent and their Scottish element look like in actual statistical terms? Well, the table now showing is a comparison of the British Argentine contingent as a whole with the Scottish element on the side. The main difficulty with any statistic derived from Holder is the section no unit identification, which means we know that 424 or 9% served, but because of the destruction of the overwhelming mass of Great War soldiers' records at Kew during World War II, we know little more, except really by chance. As Holder and others made clear, many men simply went off to fight, and in spite of the best efforts of the British Argentine community, they lost touch with the Republic completely, or they were killed before re-establishing contact. So it was very easy to overlook men or to lose information vital to their identification. Of those who could be traced, as would be expected, infantry regiments predominated, but the contingent provided far more than the average shares of Royal Engineers, Royal Artillery, and what might be termed support corps. A number like Captain Itchy Hickey also manned the very first tanks. The Army Remount Service also stole a number of estancia men to manage the half-crazy, half-wild horses they were often given to pull the gun. Now, interestingly, Holder places all of the air services men that stood at an unusually high level together. He mixed the Army, the Navy, and the new Royal Air Force in one section. A total of 222 men, or 5% of the contingent, were involved in these units, and almost all of them were flyers. Of the Scottish flyers, there were 20 of them, 5 of them were killed. But what sets the Argentine contingent further apart was that a large number of men paid to learn to fly and took their flying qualifications here in Argentina before they arrived in Britain. Now, one such was Captain Algernon Holland, later as Royal Air Force, killed while flying in Dundee in Scotland in September 1918, only a week before the end of the war. The report in the standard of his successful flight at San Fernando Aerodrome and the announcement of his departure for England ended with the remark, "A constant supply of courageous and trained flyers seemed to be assured." So returning to the Scottish element again. Of the 122 Scots killed in action and named on the memorial in San Andres, all but 3 have been positively identified. It's also immediately obvious that the Scots element differed very significantly from the whole Argentine contingent, with a far higher percentage of infantry and a lower percentage of Royal Engineers and artillery. Indeed, it's very noticeable that the number of Scots killed in action with their local regiments is remarkably high. See, those areas where the Scottish element differed significantly from the British element, the British contingent as a whole, were numbers of men born in Argentina, higher levels of promotion to officer grade, the numbers killed in action, and the tendency of the Scots to join their own local unit. In many ways, these four features can be said to form the basis of a distinct Scottish military profile, and the statistics involved are really very, very stark. In terms of place of birth, figures are only available for men killed in action, but the Scots element contained a far higher proportion of Argentine-born men than the Argentine contingent as a whole. Of the Scottish element, 27 out of 122, that's 22%, were born in Argentina, as opposed to 12% for the whole contingent. In terms of number of men commissioned, now that in the British Army means you have moved from being a non-commissioned rank, such as a private or a sergeant, up to sub-lieutenant and above. 35% of all the Argentine volunteers were commissioned. Now that figure would have been massive in any group of British soldiers, but the results for the Scottish element are even more striking. You see, more than half, 53% of these men, 251 of them, served as commissioned officers. In terms of death from all causes, the figure for the Argentine contingent as a whole is almost exactly the same as the British average of between 10 and 11%. The death rate for the Scottish element was altogether different. It's 122 out of 547, like 22% dead. That's massive. It's even worse than the Russian. And within that figure, the number of commissioned officers killed outweighed non-commissioned officers and other ranks by 62 to 55. Again, that's quite amazing. Now, unfortunately, we don't always know what units these men joined in their arrival in Scotland, but other remarks in the obituaries indicate that a number of men with specialised skills killed in units like the Engineers, who commissioned later, first joined the Scottish infantry regiments, making numbers of men serving at some time with local units far higher than the figure of 56 out of 122, and possibly as many as 100 out of 122. Of the Argentine-born men, 14 of the 28 joined Scottish units. As Jane Carmichael, who is quite an authority on the Scottish diaspora, wrote an introduction to Common Cause, which was a book dealing with the Scots who returned from overseas to fight. The whole thing appears to have been a movement driven by a strong sense of Scottish identity and allegiance to their original roots. Nevertheless, it's the staggeringly high death rate that requires most explanation here. First, the proportion of infantry is an important factor in explaining the higher Scottish casualty rate, but so also is a higher number of officers in the infantry. Taken together, casualties in the teeth arms, the infantry, the engineers, and artillery accounts for 56 of 62 officer deaths. Lewis Stemple, an authority on this area, points out that the reality was the average life of a junior infantry officer, lieutenant or second lieutenant, was only 6 weeks. Forward observation officers and Royal Engineer junior officers were pretty much the same. Also, Scottish volunteers attempted to arrive in Scotland very, very early in the war. On disembarkation in London or Liverpool, the Scots almost always went first to Scotland and were there at exactly the right time to be available for commissioning into their local infantry regiments, which in turn often became part of the Scottish assault divisions, the 9th, 15th Scottish and the 51st Highland. And this in turn had implications for the Scottish rates of men killed in action. In a general sense, the table suggests strongly that had the Scots element not been so officer heavy in the teeth arms, and the Scots less keen on joining their local units, the death rate probably wouldn't have been so high. Moving on to individuals. From what's known of their individual lives from research material both in Scotland and here in the Republic, a number of general observations can be made. You see, first, there were really two sets of immigrants. First, men from the older pioneering or merchant Scottish families and the post-1870s managerial and technical classes made up the vast majority of the Scots volunteers. Second, the smallest group, Scots of the southern Argentina, who came from the far north of Scotland and who were very generally Gaelic speakers, were rooted in the basis of knowledge, personal knowledge, trust in a shared home area, and who went to Patagonia to work on the sheep ranches in the years before the war. Men like Arthur McDougall, whose picture is on the front. The second observation is that taken as a whole, the Scots volunteers from Argentina were a very skilled, well-qualified group, operating at least the middling level of whatever they were involved in, and very, very seldom below that. Okay, not working. Yep. Any way of doing that?
See. There you go.
That one. Okay, and one again. Okay. What should also be said that when the material on the men killed in action, and I'm dealing with the men killed in action only, which is quite a small sample. Nevertheless, when it's examined, it does not match the impression of the Scots within the wider British community set out in David Rock's chapter in Bicker's Settlers and Expatriates. You see, in that chapter, Rock suggested from around 1870, there was what amounted to an ethnic division of labour in the British community in Argentina, and implicit within that suggestion was a close correlation between the British ethnicities, class, and occupation. See, he noted that many clerks, managers, and engineers immigrated under contract to British firms, displacing what he called the Celtic groups, that's the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, to the fringes of the Republic, where they became tied to agriculture, cattle, and sheep breeding. The English, on the other hand, were as Hamilton first fought, before the First World War, and Rock repeated, to be found wherever there were banks to be managed, railways to be maintained, and machinery to be sold. Now, there's a distinct impression in Rock's chapter that the English in Argentina formed something of an elite Anglo-Argentine social class based on the social mores of the British homeland. From material seen in Scotland and Argentina, this is not the case for the Scots killed in action. The estancia men, for example, now they may have been agriculturalists and there may have been a lot of them, but that broad category hides one essential fact. These men were also highly skilled and extremely well qualified agricultural managers, and they were extremely well paid for it. In terms of class, these men were the younger sons of the prosperous Scottish middle-class families, in some way connected with the progressive end of Scottish agriculture, especially sheep and cattle breeding. Occasionally, the Scottish, well, actually more than occasionally, the Scottish aristocracy also appeared on the estancias. Now, this is Lieutenant Chisholm, son and heir to the hereditary chief of Clan Chisholm, whose father sits in the House of Lords. See, of the 22 estancia men killed, 18 were British officers, while only 4 were not, and 2 of these actually refused commissions so they could stay with their friends. And don't forget, in the British Army, commission rank and social status go hand in hand, very closely linked. But not only can the estancia men be rated as highly skilled, so also were the vast majority of the other men in the memorial. You see, here's an idea, for example, is Lance Corporal John Lyle, Highland Light Infantry, who'd been trained at the Hyde Park Locomotive Works in Glasgow and Glasgow College of Technology, which is now the Technical University, which is University of Strathclyde, and he was the assistant superintendent at the Pacific Railway's electric station at Bahia Blanca. On the other side is Lieutenant William B. Field Artillery, deeply involved in the initial meteorological surveys of the Republic and who surveyed new lines for Central Argentine railways. You see, taking into account what's known from the roll of honour entries and obituaries, skills level of the Scottish migrant at that time, estimated by the 2 most important historians of Scottish migration, that's Thomas and Flynn, are woefully low for these guys. The second major observation is that when the statistics are assembled, which take account of other British ethnicities, interesting results follow. You see, for Sir Tom Devine, who is probably the foremost Scottish historian at present, living historian, He looks at the figure of 9%, because 9% was the percentage of the British population that were Scots. So any group with less than 9% Scots are underrepresented. More than 9%, whoopie-doo, they're overrepresented. Okay? Now, Rock argues strongly that the English dominated the railways and everything else except for agriculture. However, when the names of those who worked for the 6 railway companies which published roles of service are checked against the names on the equivalent section of the memorials and indicts, the following is true. You see, Buenos Aires and Pacific Railways, 9%. Buenos Aires Great Southern, 20%. Oh my goodness, Scots are vastly overrepresented. Central Argentine Railways, well represented, and the same. Only the Cordova, Central and Interiors are not. You see, the 6 companies which sent 1,040 volunteers, 121 of whom, or 12%, were Scots. And you can see the figures there for yourself. Most Scots also tended to occupy the middle to higher grade professional roles such as accountants, engineers, and administrators. Of the 24 Scots railwaymen killed, at least 16 appeared to have occupied posts of that time, while most of the others were in specialist or supervisory roles. See, one of these was Captain Glasgow. Very, very highly qualified man. But so too also was the Edinburgh University Lieutenant Stuart Angus, who was very highly regarded as an expert in the field. Others like Lieutenant Pearson, the Commons, who was killed, was another of the aristocratic Scots who arrived there. But finding engine drivers and firemen who were Scots was a little bit harder, a lot harder actually. Bankers follow a similar pattern. You see, again, this contradicts law. 22% of the Argentine-based bankers who were killed were Scotsmen. Again, way above 9%. Staff obituaries where these exist indicate employees recruited for their Argentine section were operating well above bank teller level. These types of positions fitted exactly the profile of Scotsmen described by Devine as men who understood they would have to move, probably overseas, to further their careers. The fact that these men were sent out first class indicates their status. Another quantifiable indicator which suggests the middle and upper class nature of the Scots element can be found in the educational background of the men killed. Of those Scots who were killed, and schools can be traced through a trove of existing school memorials, archives, and obituaries appearing in either country, at least 75 of the 122 men went to socially elite private schools like Fraser or to the academically elite Scottish high school like Kirkcaldy High School and Montrose Academy. In this context, the exceptionally high rate of commissioning amongst the Scots becomes far, far less than private. For upper class Scots, Eton and Sandhurst was not uncommon. Sir Herbert Gibson's son was one of an unknown number who took that road, and he survived. More common was St. George's, Buenos Aires, followed by Marlborough or Malvern, then Oxford or Cambridge, an imperial trajectory cut short for at least six of the Scots Argentines killed in action, including Lieutenant Agar of the Seaforth. You see, Scottish networks like those described by Devine, and I'll put up the slide here where the translation is, you can see. Okay. See, these Scottish networks were very, very important. But you see, you can prove, this can be proved, these to have existed in Argentina well after the Great War. The War Service list of Dollar Academy, as well as the photographic and other evidence from its archive, provides an opportunity to look at one school former pupil network. It indicates that while the Argentine-born Lance Corporal G.A. McCorkadale was killed, another $5 former pupils also served as volunteers. Photographs of the first 3 rugby 15s show the origins as well as the names of boys So it's clear that there were at least another 4 Scots-Argentine families with boys at Dole. And there may also have been at least 2 sets of Scottish cousins. The photograph of the Buenos Aires Dollar Academy Club annual cocktail party of 1951, published in the Standard, shows the presence, even then, of the Republic in the network. But Dollar Academy is not alone in this. Fettes, even more prestigious, if less, had a less well-documented network of Fetisans in the Republic before and immediately after the war. And in the Argentine letter, which appeared annually in the Fetesian, dozens of men resident in the country were named. Their annual dinner party held at La Rural on the eve of the agricultural show indicated their involvement in the stand. Harriet's connection with the Bank of London, South America, for example, provided dozens of enterprising former pupils with a start in a career in overseas banking. These are only 2 examples. Finally, many Argentine employers guaranteed jobs on demobilization, but others did not, and many men hired for a specific period which is now past never returned. Overall, Andrew Gremiot estimated the rate of return for all Argentine volunteers at around 25%. Accurate figures are rare, but the Central Argentine Railway rule offers one isolated glimpse of a group of returnees, because alone of all the railway companies, it published a list of those who were killed, returned, or resigned. Of the 411 British volunteers of that company, 179 or 44% who could return actually did return. The Scottish rate was 52, a bit higher. Of course, when the last of the volunteers returned home and the Allied victory parade was all over, the time for community remembrance had arrived. There had been discussions about a Scottish War Memorial before the armistice, but in 1919, in March, St Andrews School agreed to the St Andrews Society formal proposal that a Scottish War Memorial building be attached to St Andrews School. The stated purpose of this memorial was to highlight the courage and sacrifice of those who risked their lives to defend the land in which their fathers were born. The start of the memorial project actually signaled the return of the Scottish community to a clearly identifiable presence in the Republic, and the Standard and Buenos Aires Herald carried major articles about the proposed memorial in addition to their normal coverage of Scottish affairs. You see, on the outbreak of the war, the very powerful St Andrews Scottish St Andrews Society of the River Plate decided that there would be no overlapping of support efforts for the motherland. And because its members had involved themselves so deeply in the beginning, from the very beginning of the hostilities, in various British wartime projects, the society would have no distinct war activity of its own. In short, Scottish identity was consciously merged with wartime with a larger British and particularly imperial identity. Given their community's history in the Republic and the Scots-Argentine support for the Empire in the South African War, this represented a major departure from what might otherwise have been expected of the Scots. Scottish community effort was confined to raising money for the Scottish Red Cross through individual appeals and the production of a Scottish concert in Buenos Aires for the purposes of community morale. All other work was tagged as British. However, with the armistice and the winding down of war work, the Scots community and its leadership were released from all previous constraints. This newly released impetus to social action found a focus in the War Memorial Project, and it seemed that the Scots as a whole turned with great speed to the first post-war community endeavour. The leadership now drove the project as Scottish members of the St Andrews Society, not as British functionaries. In the same way, fundraising was now directed to purely Scottish Argentine causes, and the wartime British label and its activities that covered every Scottish enterprise was quietly dropped. Besides, almost all members of the St Andrews Society that I've been able to trace had a personal stake in this. In other words, they lost people. The responsibility for the project was assumed by the War Memorial Committee, all of whom were members of the St Andrews Society of the River Plate. Now that's open only to Scotsmen and men of Scottish descent, and this was the driving force. In turn, they could count on the assistance of St Andrews Lodge number 3706, membership of which was open only to members of the St Andrews Society. A Scottish overseas tradition of which Tom Devine terms the use of chains of networks of Scottish connection and patronage between fellow Scots was in operation from the very beginning. Who's going to design it? Well, two members of St Andrews Lodge and the St Andrews Society, Smith and Foley, architects both of the highly acclaimed Retiro railway station in Buenos Aires, designed it. Foley had attended the Edinburgh School of Art. He'd won the King's Prize for Architectural Design in 1904. By 1908, he was a draftsman with Lutyens. Before he emigrated to Argentina in 1910, Smith trained at the Glasgow School of Art and the Royal Technical College. Again, that is now part of Strathclyde University. Had worked on the restoration of famous place called Craigievar Castle in Aberdeenshire. And here's their work. Here's what I'm talking about. Now, with that kind of architectural background, it'll come as no surprise that the memorial building was built in such an unmistakably Scottish baronial style. There is at least a passing resemblance in its part to the castles of Aberdeenshire and to the houses of Stirling Oak. Okay. Then comes fundraising. That was a community effort, very much in the Scottish style. At the opening of the memorial, the speaker described how some gave a little and some gave a great deal, but they all gave nobly, for they gave what they could. In fact, the entire project was paid for 6 months before the door even opened. Who was to be commemorated? That was done on the basis of lists of volunteers published in Argentina and personal knowledge of who was not a Scotsman. Is this realistic? Oh yes. As discussed earlier, the Memorial Committee, members of the St Andrews Society, were close to the heart of a massive step in interconnected Scottish network. Membership of the Society stood at 445, and it included men who lived and worked in every part of the Republic. Besides, by 1914, almost all employers required references or letters of introductions, so it would be almost impossible to deny or assert a false Scottish identity. So who were they? Other Scotsmen agreed you were a Scotsman. That's simple. Argentine-born men. This is vital, very important. Argentine-born men of acknowledged Scottish descent. Their main residence was in Argentina, but men on long leave in Britain who'd been given leave from an employer to stay away for several years, and students who joined their on it. Scots attested of men who'd taken the oath in Argentina who died before they got to Britain, and there were two of these: Scottish birth or descent and Argentine residence with service in another imperial contingent. There were 3 Canadians. In a very real sense, the Buenos Aires Memorial is more ethnically Scots than the Scottish National War Memorial, and the criteria for being named on it is even more rigorous. What's the long-term significance of this? In my opinion, and it's only an opinion, to me, in one sense, the commemoration of the Scottish dead in the War Memorial Building was an act of remarkable self-confidence in the Scottish future in Argentina and in the state of Argentina itself even. You see, I suspect many other Latin American countries would not have been very happy with this. As an event of symbolic importance to the Scottish community, it probably ranks alongside the first St Andrew's Day dinner in 1824. But the memorial itself, an extension of St Andrew's School, is highly functional, with the memorial tablets formally unveiled in 1925, which were a standing archive of the dead. It also secured the future of St Andrew's School, one of the pillars of Scottish identity in the Republic, which is very badly in need of more accommodation and in serious danger of losing pupils simply because of lack of space. Now, this was a real mixture of the symbolic and the functional, and built in the Scottish baronial style. And in the eyes of Scots Argentines and anyone who saw it, a very, very Scottish memorial. The grand opening on the 23rd of May, only 2 days before the 25th de Mayo, 1921, left no doubt as to the Scottish origins of this event. It began with the Argentine national anthem, followed by the old one and the Psalm 100, all people that on earth do dwell, which is almost like a national hymn. In Scots Way, the unofficial Scottish national anthem, composed by our national poet, Philip Burns, and it ended with God Save the King. For me, in my opinion, in many ways, it was no less than a reassertion of Scottish identity in the Argentine Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Let me, para que saco esto antes. No, ahí deja de compartir. Ahí está. Well, thank you very much for your presentation and your visit to our country and to our university and program. We're very happy to have you here. After 2 years, we were going to have a talk. Do you remember in 2020?
Oh, my goodness, yes.
And we have to cancel it because of the pandemic. So we're very happy to have you finally at the university and at the program. Ahora lo que vamos a hacer es abrir el encuentro a las preguntas, consultas o dudas que tengan. Si quieren pueden, ahí veo que alguien está levantando la mano. Roberto, si quieren ir poniéndose en el chat quienes quieren hablar, y les vamos a ir dando por orden la palabra. Pueden escribir en castellano y nosotros les traducimos al inglés, o hablar, en castellano, o hablar directamente o preguntar directamente en inglés y nosotros les traducimos. Roberto, no sé si querés comenzar.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the presentation, and I'm here in Chile, and I've done research about the volunteers who went to Britain from Chile, and we cannot relate the Chilean history regarding the volunteers from Great Britain, from England, Scotland, who went from Chile, without talking about Argentina, because it was the melting pot where most of the volunteers sailed from in South America. There was also a St. Andrew Society here in Chile, and sometimes there will be a very, very thin line between being in Argentina, being in Chile, being in Peru, etc., etc. Even in Patagonia, in the Magellan Strait, sometimes the British community in the Magellan Strait would cross over between the Chilean part of the Magellan Strait and the Argentine part, half of the Patagonia. So I really appreciate what you said regarding the Scots volunteers here, because I'm currently working on not the First World War, because I've done some of it about Chile in this First World War, but the Second World War, where again the contribution of the Anglo-Argentine community was pretty special, especially regarding the River Plate House in London, where many volunteers from Chile or Argentina during the Second World War who wouldn't know where to go because they had no family in the UK, they would get assistance from the River Plate Committee, so they could settle in London while they were being mobilized. So thank you very much.
Right.
I'm sorry, I can't hear. Is there an audio?
Ahí está.
You can hear me. Regarding Chile, one of the things that I have found when I was doing research, and this is First World War, is that the amount of men who went from Chile and who were of from the shepherding agricultural areas had already previous knowledge of the other guys there. In other words, it was very much family orientated. In particular, there is a parish, this is a small partido in the island of Lewis off the west coast of Scotland. And that little island sent so many men, I can't remember the figure just off the top of my head, but it sent so many men, all from the same extended families who were intermarried and so forth. Many times, first to the Falkland Islands, then they appeared in Patagonia, and then they appeared in Chile. Then they appeared on the Western Front, and they were almost all in a regiment called the Seaforth Highlanders. Okay, you will see if you go through the South Pacific Mail, you will see that name come up. You will also see another one, which is that from the adjoining area, and that's the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. But they will probably just be called the Camerons. You won't find too many in the Black Watch or the Gordons. The Gordons came from cattle country. You'll find Gordons you'll find a lot of Gordons and a lot of Black Watch here in Argentina. You'll also find them in Chile, but particularly the Black Watch, they will be engineers. And they will have to do with the mining, or they'll be railways. Some will be of another kind. They are old and from older families. I know in Scotland an old man, and when the book was published, it appeared in the newspaper, and I got a phone call one day, and this was from a man who was related to the family Riddle. I think in Chile you call it Riddell. In Scotland it's called Riddle. Just hard R. His grandmother married one of the Riddell sons, who joined the Scottish Horse, the cavalry, Scottish cavalry. He later became a pilot. He later returned. He lived, but with bad health because flying without oxygen. His son came over, studied in Scotland in one of these Scottish high schools I was talking about, and later became a flight commander in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. The family there is still a Scottish branch of the Riddles, and in Chile, I understand there is a significant branch of Riddell, still in Valparaiso. So there's quite a lot of this connection, and yes, a lot of it, if you bear in mind the Seaforths and where they come from, that is often the clue. When you talk about individual Seaforths, their museum is in Inverness at a place called Fort George. And if you look up Seaforth, Highlander, etc., you will find on the web, you will find that. That I help, okay?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Great.
Bien. Ok, ¿hay alguien más que les gustaría hacer una pregunta, una consulta? A ver, ahí tenemos una. Ahí, Jennifer Hayward desde Chile, from Chile.
More on
Yes.
Señor Castro.
Yes.
Yeah. See there, yeah. I see you have on here on the screen. I'd love to know more about the picture. when I found the Scottish War Memorial, I had an article in the local newspaper published saying that talking about the memorial, and I dealt with various of people from my regiment, from the Black Watch, and men from Perthshire who were on it. The thing was unannounced, and I didn't ask for it. Suddenly, a big copy of that picture came through the post to me, and it came from a family in Sutherland, and the man's name is McDougall, Archie McDougall, and he was killed in 1915 on the, I think it was 16, on a ship called the Invernia. He was a sharpshooter for the Scottish Rifles and had been an Argyll and Sutherland Highlander before the war. The problem, his thing was this. He came from an island in Easthill, and the industry there was slate, and slate is used for roofing. And this is a very, very high quality slate. The quarry ran out. The work ceased, but he had relatives who had been in the Falkland Islands, and he went to Bahia Blanca. He went to join them when they moved to Bahia Blanca in 1912. He prospered there. He did very well, but unfortunately, he was much upset and disturbed by the war. I suspect that when I remember the date he came back to Scotland, it would fall after a battle called Luce. And Luce was sometimes called the Scottish battle because we provided 50%, more than 50% of the assault divisions. Okay, and this was very early in the war before we all learned better. Okay, and I think he lost relatives, and this was a revenge coming back. That was not uncommon. That was actually more common than we know. I hope that was some help.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have another question from Florencia Rola.
Yes, hello. I'm sorry, first of all, if I'm asking something you already said, but I had a problem with the audio. So I just was curious about the Scottish men. What percentage of these men were born in Argentina or from first or second generations of immigrants? And if you know, or maybe you already said it, so I apologize if you already did, but if you know how many of the men that were not killed in action came back to Argentina, or they stayed there in Scotland. Is there any...
Let me tell you about that one. The way British military records are written and the way newspapers discuss people, particularly in obituaries, if you want to be remembered, get killed. Okay, that's how you do it. But joking apart, the information that is of highest quality, the best stuff is always about dead men. But from time to time, somebody does something else. He wins a medal or something like that. So you get information there. I think what happened with a lot of the men who went back was many of them were wounded. And some of them who had perhaps been in remote parts of Argentina would think very carefully, do I go back to Argentina or do I stay in Scotland where I know I will get the medical help, where my pension, because they will get an allowance from the government for their wounds, for every wound. Do I go back to Argentina and take a chance or not? Okay, that will go through their heads. And I think a number of the men who are perhaps quite badly wounded would not return. The other thing is this is the part that people forget. There was a contact in the trenches between the men who came from Argentina and the men who'd never seen Argentina, who couldn't even probably spell it. There was a family called, I think, this is where I'm on very shaky ground. There's a family called Lucas in England. And one of the Lucas men was in the Royal Artillery. He was a British officer. And he was one of the people who, amongst many other things, he looked after the training of the horses to pull the guns. Yeah? He met a number of other of Scotsmen from Aberdeenshire, which is where they have a lot of very good horses too. Lucas gave them jobs here in Argentina, at least eight of these men who he knew in the war. And he said he would go along to them and say, I think I could give you a job in Argentina if you want, and it's a nice place, etc. And some of them wrote their memoirs about, they didn't like the big carts. They didn't like some of the oxen, but they thought the horses were pretty. In other words, they stayed for many, many years, and some of them are still here. It is not, amongst the people from the islands, Lewis Harris, the Outer Hebrides, you still get people turning up, speaking Spanish, not much English, with names like Mackenzie and McLaughlin. And I have one of my great friends, before he died recently, was called MacLeod, and he had one of his relatives turned up from Argentina, from the far south, and visited Perth. Not much English, and Donny, he had plenty of Gaelic, he had a lot of Gaelic, and English, but no Spanish. So you can imagine, but that is true. So that contact's around, you know, it's not gone. Did that answer the question?
Okay. Okay. Any other question, Florencia? Or? Excellent. We have another question from Paula.
Yes, I actually have two questions for you.
Right.
The first one is, I was very interested when I was hearing you speak, when you talked about how well educated and how very qualified were the recruits from the Scottish community coming from here.
Yeah.
And I was thinking something along Florencia's lines, because I was thinking whether that might mean that, how shall I say this? I have a theory that money preserves identity for longer. That is, while they were in Argentina, in order to preserve a Scottish identity or a British identity for all of that, they had to belong to certain associations and go to certain schools, and every association demanded a fee, because that's how they survived, right? So if you had the money, you could remain Scottish or British or English or whatever for longer. So you could be third generation and still afford to feel Scottish.
Very interesting idea.
And that's how, maybe that's why they were so well educated and so. I wanted to try that out on you.
I think that's an exciting idea. That's a very, very exciting idea. You see, just thinking about what you're saying, forget about being a student at an elite school for a moment, and think on being a clever boy in a village school in Scotland. In village schools in Scotland, first of all, I have to tell you, the Scottish educational system is totally separate from the English, totally. We have always had graduate teachers. Okay, it's just what we did. If at that time, all state school pupils had to reach a certain standard and pass basically pass a test. That was called the qualifier. Those children who passed that test were not at 1890 right up to what had to stay in school in Scotland till you were 14.
Oh.
And mostly this happened. So what do you do with these children? Well, one of the things they did was they taught them a little Latin. And and so forth. And some of these children then, let's say, become shepherds. And suddenly, lo siento mucho, pero, and somos, soy, eres, fue, and so forth. You have a little Latin, and suddenly you're speaking a little Spanish. And if you didn't do this, and you spoke Gaelic, no.
No.
So there was this little bit, the educational side that would add. But you see, those children who would be that, they would be not the sons of the man who digs the ditch. They are the sons of the man who tells him
Exactly.
to do that.
Right.
So even in this small way, there is a distinction. These days are gone in Scotland and most other places. There was once a thriving rural middle class. And that's my class. That's where I come from, which always had one foot in the army and the other foot on the land. But they were essentially middle class with middle class values.
Yeah.
And they were the supervisors. They were in estancia terms, they were the mayordomo.
Right.
Yeah, they were the mayordomo. And they will be the ones who go. And they will have that little bit more ambition. Does that any help?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does. Yeah. My other question was, I was thinking while you were talking about this Scottish memorial and all the commemorations here in Buenos Aires, what about, well, maybe you haven't come across it, but I was thinking, what happened with the relation with the German community in Buenos Aires? Because that's something very interesting. Because before the war, they were living, they were living side by side. The German community and the whole British community in Buenos Aires, at least, were living side by side in the same neighborhoods. And then the war came. What happened when they came back? Well, and during the war, of course.
Yeah. I think I would answer that like this. Before the war, I know in Buenos Aires there were one of the ways, if you were a foreigner, one of the ways to gain almost status is to do work for charity. Yeah, and be a good guy. The Scot, if you look at, and I did this at St Andrews, I found the material which showed the committee members and the people who ran certain charities, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, Siemens Mission, and there were one or two others. I regret, I can't remember the name. If you look at who was on the committee, who was running this, who's in charge, the German, and okay, there are British there. Most of the British are Scots. Agar is one. Lieutenant Agar killed the Scottish War Memorial, and the others, because you need to remember there is a relation, there is a almost like a conscious affinity in some ways. Religion is always, God help us, religion is always a thing. The Scots are Calvinists. They tend, okay, there were Catholics and there are Catholic Scots. Probably more now than there ever were before. But at the time that we're talking about, I would say 90% of all Scots were Presbyterian. 5% would have been Anglican. Another 5%, if that, were Catholics. The Catholic community was not large. It was large in some areas, but I remember being. This is a terrible story, but I'm going to tell you it anyway, because it will illustrate exactly what I mean. When I was 12, I went to the big school in the town, you know, I was a country boy. And one of my friends said to me, oh, that's cool. There's this guy over there. Who's he? Catholic.
Right.
I thought it was, until somebody told me that, I thought, most of us thought a Catholic was a funny kind of horse. We didn't know. If you come from the west of Scotland, my God, you know from a very early age what is Catholic and what is Protestant. But in the rural parts of Scotland where I came from, that wasn't the case. What you did know was who was an Episcopalian, who was an Anglican. Because the Anglican church was the church of the landlord.
Of course.
And you don't trust them. You don't cross them. It's just a little bit crazy, but that's how it was.
What about other non-conformists?
Non-conformists.
Minorities?
Oh, they were okay. They were okay. They were one of the things about Protestantism and Presbyterians is they all have lots of opinions, and within, you know, just as within the Catholic Church, you have different wings. There were Congregationalists, and not very few. We seldom saw them. There would be a little town like my grandparents lived in. There might be a small congregational church, or there might be some Baptist or Methodist, but a few Methodists. But mostly it was Church of Scotland, mostly. They sort of rubbed along together from about 1800. They rubbed along together one way or another, you know. And that was what they had in common with the Germans. So that when my great-grandfather was a piper, he was a pipe major in the Scottish Regiment in 1914, and 2 minutes before, with the 5th Blood Ward, the Angus Battalion, and he with his sons, and 2 minutes before midnight in 1914, he pulled his bagpipes and played. And a few minutes later, at midnight, the Germans sung back, and they sung back the German hymn, Danket alle God, which we know, and as a fairly well-known Scottish hymn tune. And then they played again. They didn't do anything. And they didn't even shoot them. But joking apart, you know, it's when you look at it, there are all these connections. But I think your idea of the relationship between remaining with a Scot with any identity and fire, I think it's a more general principle. I think it's a very exciting idea. I think it's a good one.
Okay, worth checking then. We'll see.
I have two questions also in line of Paula's and Florencia's questions about the representation of this Scottish in the Black Watch. And you show us a couple of statistics, and you said they were overrepresented as Scottish in British Army. These Argentine Scottish were overrepresented. I would like to ask you if this overrepresentation is equal to the overrepresentation the Scottish had in Argentina. I mean, I don't remember for the beginning of the 20th century, but for the first half of the 19th century, the Scottish were overrepresented between the immigrants to Argentina. So maybe this had something to say about the movements.
Yeah, I think it has. The overrepresentation has to do with, in part, the economics the economic situation in Scotland. One of the things that you have to remember when you talk about, for example, the symmetry, in Scottish law, there are three types of people. There are owners, there are what are known in law as servants, and there are trespassers, or people who shouldn't be there, right? There is no distinction, there are no set of social distinctions, except owner, trespasser, and servant. And when they came to Argentina, quite suddenly this goes. And then they write home. And the same tale as the immigrants. I had an Argentine friend who visited about 4 years ago, Scotland. And we went to the Blackboard Museum, and deliberately I went to a little place in the middle of nowhere, okay, called, this is the historical paradox. It's called St. Martin's. And there's a little church called St. Martin's. And St. Martin's is San Martin. Ah, what a mistake. Ah. And my goodness, out of that parish to Argentina went 20 different people, all adults, mostly adult males, but some women as well. And they left, but they left with a trade. They brought with them a skill, which was in most cases not agricultural. Two were carpenters, three were because of the economy of the local economy at the time. 3 or 4 were blacksmiths, they were metal workers. Hard, you know, the hard stuff, put shoes on horses, do metal work. Others were weavers, but not just any old weavers. These are stocking weavers, and this is quite a trade. It was a luxury trade.
Highly skilled.
Oh my goodness, yes. And they left simply because of what I told you about. This is, here we go, here is a chance. But the thing was, they were willing to take the chance, because remember, you can go to America, you can go to Canada, and they all speak English, and there will be a Scottish community there. But they had a different vision, and it came from a man called Davidson. And Davidson was very important to the British in Argentina. I think you know his name, but he's the man who negotiated the war supplies for the Allies. And he came from this little parish, and he still has relatives there, because one of them wrote to me when the book was published. He read the South American chapter. And someone, and sadly he's dead, but he went to Argentina. The original Davidson was, I don't know if you're aware of this, he was ennobled. He was, I think he was made a baronet. Oh. You know, he's a sir. My goodness. And of course, the other place we went to was Dundee, where we drove around the docks. Like Dundee is not Lavaca, but it sort of was once a pretty thriving port, looking for a particular street where a guy called Francisco Durand, who's the one who has the frigate of the Argentine Navy, is named after him. He was born in Dundee. He was the one who was the fiancé of Eliza Brown, Guillermo Brown's daughter. And we went to see if we could find his birthplace, and we did. We found the place where his street was. So, but the point was, they were willing to take the chance, and they had some feeling. I always think it's some feeling that there is a better way, and that if you let's just say they had faith, a lot of faith.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, You told us you were very surprised how fast the Scottish community built the war memorial.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, when I read your paper and what you talk right now, if this had something or a lot to do with where it was built and who was behind the building of this Scottish memorial, thinking of not only the St. Andrew's School, but it has been and still is one of the centers of the reconstruction of the Scottish identity and in Argentina, and the St. Andrew's School is it's the church school, it's the Presbyterian school.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know if you think about that, if you could rebuild the social and economic networks between school, church, and war memorial.
Yeah. I think, and they had, I think they had a little bit of luck. There is always luck. The first piece of luck they had was with these men who built it, who designed it. These were highly experienced, very well trained people who, with a track record of having done a successful project, Retiro. It's as successful as it gets. They also, leaving aside the cultural part, it's pretty obvious that what the influence was. But leaving that aside, the idea that you don't take, at that time, a lot of Scots people would have said, you don't take debt, no credit, money up front. Now, I think they also may have had a project with the drawings and the finance at a time when there was when perhaps the building trade was not so busy as normal. Yeah. So I think that may have been a factor. I can't prove this, Elena, but I'm pretty sure, because following wars like that, one of the first things to go is the building trade.
Yes.
So you come along, and they didn't just choose any old builder. I can't remember the name of the firm, but it was was a very highly regarded building firm, and what a job they made of it. Absolutely excellent. But when the Scots turn on themselves, they do it to the exclusion of just about everything else. They're what we sometimes very cruelly call one-shot wonders. It's this, and you have tunnel vision. If you look at who's in the St. Andrew's Society and you look at the dead, you will find that's what I meant when I said they all have a stake in this. Too many dead sons, dead brothers.
Well, and also I think that they were all, you said, highly skilled and qualified. They were rich, so they had money also. Yeah. You need also money to build this.
And of course, the Scottish interest in the estancias. The estancia people were giving money or goods, particularly horses. They were over to the British war effort. They were giving mules as well. I mean, they didn't have it all their own way. There were problems. The German agents were at work in Argentina like everybody else. It's a war. And they managed to poison a whole shipload of mules. Mm-hmm. Now, these mules are very, very valuable, not so much for the Western Front, but Mesopotamia, because we were fighting the Turks as well. We're fighting everybody. We're fighting the Turks as well. And we needed mules in Mesopotamia. And that shipload of mules would have caused amazing, terrible, terrible trouble. Because when you talk about a shipload of mules, you're talking about probably thousands. You could probably transport in the ships they had at that point, probably 2,000 mules. And 2,000 mules is enough to equip 2 army divisions. And when you think of it in these terms, and some of the gifts that came from Argentina for the British war effort in terms of packed meat. My goodness. I mean, the Argentina in gifts from the British community probably fed the British Army for about 2 or 3 months. Can you imagine providing the meat for a whole army? And then we come to the grain, and then we come to the leather. Without Argentine war supplies, I haven't seen figures, or I haven't seen any work in fact on this. But as I'm making an educated guess, if we had lost Argentine war supplies, I'm not sure what we would have done. Because you saw when Germany lost it, you saw what happened by the end of the war. My God. Absolutely.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if there's any other question. ¿Hay otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más quiere consultar algo? O yo tengo extra. Yes. Another one from Paula.
I have an extra question that I just
okay.
remembered.
Right.
You spoke about the lobbying that the
Yes.
Argentines did to get this patch,
Yes.
the BBLA patch.
BBLA, yep.
Right. Could you tell us something about that? Because that's the first
Right.
I've heard of it, so I'm very interested.
When I talk about lobbying, I mean in the traditional British sense. I know there was lobbying from the army itself. I would have to, I know how to find this, but I need to be at my desk in Scotland, in which case I will send it to you.
Okay, that's great.
But there's also political lobbying. And that, to let you understand, there were a number of members of parliament who were British officers. And one who was a British private soldier, but never mind. They would also lobbied on all sorts of things, everything from boots to corned beef to whatever, and they are known to have lobbied on this. One of the things the British almost never do is they are very, very slow or very unwilling to give recognition that is not by the book, but it's absolutely, you're in the such and such regiment and you get to wear a red feather and that's it. No white feather, red feather or nothing, I'm pretty sure that most effective lobbying would have come from those members of parliament who were involved with being soldiers at the same time. But one of the things that soldiers are often good at doing, particularly senior ones, when they want something like that, is to say to politicians, we think you should be doing this. And the politician will probably not agree. But in the end, they will often get their way.
So you think it's someone who knew firsthand
yeah,
the importance of this effort?
Yeah. See, the argument went like this. Men from Canada were Canadian, Scots from Canada were British from Canada, right. They were Canadian uniform. They know each other. Australia, New Zealand, all the rest, South Africa, and I mean, even Fiji. Well, that's it. But what about 10,000 men? The BVLA, there are different estimates, but I think it's about 10,500. That's a lot of men. That is the infantry strength of a division. Yeah. A whole division. And they've come, okay, they're mixed up all through the army, but they've come back to a country where they've been away for a long time. They don't know each other. So it's not just a nice thing. There's a military purpose to it, and that military purpose is morale. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, si no hay otras preguntas, podemos dar por concluido el encuentro. So we can say thank you to Fraser, and we can close with a clap.
So much.
Thank you very
Really
much.
fascinating.
Yes. And where can the people buy your new book?
Well, it's going to reprint.
Where?
It's going to reprint?
It's on the print.
in the middle of its second edition.
Oh, excellent.
So
That's great.
it will be, we published 500. We thought we didn't know whether we'd sell them all. My God, we'd be surprised with it. So,
Well, if it's going to a second edition, I can very well imagine. Well,
just wait till-
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Well,
ahead.
Yeah, we're ahead. Yeah.
And thank you
That's
very much
great.
for
Yeah.
all the people who came.
Well,
to-
So when you get the second edition,
We'll give you a shout.
yeah, please give us a shout so that we can tell everybody to get your book.
Exactly.
There is,
I
what was I going to say? I got Maria Inez.
Ah,
She
Marina.
said, would I do a talk on the book, on how
Yeah.
we got it to work, because it's because it was unusual.
Mhm.
It's pretty unusual. We were nominated for a Saltire Award,
Wow.
but we were nominated and it was accepted. We didn't make the lead. We didn't, as you can see, I'm still poor and we didn't make it. But no,
Next book.
next book. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But no, it's 1854 Crimean War to about 1900, we think.
Right.
And then the next one will be 1900 to the last day of peace.
That's great.
There's so much.
Yes.
One of the things I've been doing soldiers' letters. In the Crimea, one of the good things about the Black was these Scottish regiments, they were mostly literate.
Yes.
Most of them all right. So they write home, dear wife, today we had a telling all the bad things.
Well,
So
that's
is everybody
Great
gone?
sources.
No, well,
Not everybody.
no, but we can say goodbye and see you on our next meeting, PECBAL meeting.